The war took many things from many men. It took brothers and fathers and sons. It took farms left unplanted and debts left unpaid and years that could never be recovered from the lives of the young men who had gone away believing in something and come back believing in very little. It took limbs and sight and the particular kind of easy sleep that belongs only to people who have never seen what men are capable of doing to one another. For me, it took the use of my legs. And in the months that followed, quietly and without the drama of a single decisive moment, it took the woman I had believed was going to be my wife. My name is Samuel. I was 28 years old in the autumn of 1864 when a Confederate shell found the trench where my regiment had taken cover outside Petersburg, Virginia. I remember the sound of it, that specific whistling that every soldier learned to fear, and I remember the impact, and I remember nothing after that for what I was later told was 4 days. I woke up at a field hospital that smelled of blood and carbolic acid and the particular desperation of men doing their best with what they had, and I understood from the way my legs felt, which was to say that they felt like nothing at all, that something had changed in me that was not going to change back. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Because this story needs to travel. It needs to find the people who have felt what I felt, who have lain in the dark and understood that sometimes the world breaks you in two places at once, and you're left to decide, entirely alone, whether the pieces are worth gathering. Let me tell you about her first. Before the war. Before Petersburg. Before all of it. Her name was Catherine. She was the daughter of the town doctor in Millhaven, the small Ohio town where I had grown up and where my family had farmed the same stretch of land for 2 generations. She had dark hair and steady gray eyes and a way of speaking that was direct and unhurried and entirely without the performance that most young women of that era were trained from childhood to maintain. She said what she thought. She asked questions that made you reconsider things you had believed or settled. She read everything she could find and argued about what she had read with anyone willing to engage. I was more than willing. We had known each other since childhood in the distant way of people who grow up in the same small place, aware of each other without yet understanding why that awareness mattered. It was not until I was 22 and she was 20 that the awareness sharpened into something else entirely. A church social in June, a conversation that started about a book and ended 2 hours later with neither of us having spoken to another soul. And a walk home afterward through the warm evening with fireflies in the long grass beside the road, and the particular feeling of a world rearranging itself around a new and central fact. I courted her for a year. Her father approved of me, cautiously, the way fathers approve of young men who have demonstrated competence, but not yet demonstrated the deeper qualities that matter more. Her mother approved unreservedly, which meant more in practical terms. We were not formally engaged when I enlisted in the spring of 1862, but we had spoken plainly to each other about what we intended, and she had pressed my hand to the train station with both of hers and looked at me with those steady gray eyes and said, "Come back to me, Samuel." That is all I ask. I had every intention of keeping that promise. The war had other intentions. 2 years of it. 2 years of mud and cold, and the particular boredom punctuated by terror that defines a soldier's existence. 2 years of her letters arriving in camp, folded small and worn soft from reading and rereading in the lamplight of 100 different tents in 100 different positions across the Virginia countryside. Her letters were not the sentimental kind, not full of longing and poetic declarations. They were newsy and sharp and occasionally funny, and always completely herself. She told me about the town, about her father's patience, about the books she was reading, about the debates she was having with the minister about things the minister would have preferred not to debate. I lived for those letters. I was reading one of them, the last one she had sent 3 days before Petersburg. I remember that clearly. I remember the paper between my fingers and her handwriting and the way she had ended it, as she always ended them, the same 3 words she had said at the train station. "Come back, Samuel." I came back, just not the way either of us had imagined. Stay with me, because what happened when I came home, the way she looked at me, and what came after that look is the part that still sits heavy in my chest on cold mornings. You need to hear all of it. They transported me north by train in the late autumn of 1864. The journey took 4 days and existed in my memory as a series of disconnected images. The faces of the orderlies who moved me, the gray sky through the window above my cot, the sound of other men in other states of ruin in the cars around me, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by suffering and being unable to offer or receive any meaningful comfort. My mother met me at the station in Millhaven with my younger brother Thomas, in a wagon they had padded with quilts for the journey home. My mother did not cry when she saw me. She held my face in both hands and looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "You are home now," and her voice was steady and her eyes were dry, and I have never admired anyone more in my life than I admired her in that moment. Thomas cried enough for both of them. He was 17 and had been too young to enlist, and had spent 2 years carrying the guilt of that alongside the fear of losing me. And when he saw me alive, his relief collapsed into tears that he made no attempt to contain. I held on to him with both arms and let him cry and felt for the first time since Petersburg, something that was not pain or emptiness or the gray nothing of shock. I felt home. Catherine came the following afternoon. I had been settled into the front room of my parents' farmhouse, which my mother had rearranged entirely to accommodate me. The bed moved down from upstairs, a clear path to the door, every unnecessary piece of furniture removed with a practical efficiency that told me she had been planning this since the telegram arrived. I was propped on pillows when I heard the knock, and then my mother's voice in the hallway, and then Catherine's answering voice, and something in my chest tightened with a feeling I could not yet identify. She came into the room. She was wearing a dark blue dress, and her hair was pinned up, and she looked exactly like herself. Exactly like the woman I had been reading letters from for 2 years. Exactly like the woman whose face I had carried in my mind through every cold night and every terrible morning of the last 2 years. And I watched something happen in her face when she saw me. It was there for only a moment. A flicker, a shift, something moving behind the gray eyes that she covered quickly and replaced with a smile and forward motion, crossing the room to take my hand and sit beside me and begin talking in her characteristic, direct way about things that were not the thing that was filling the room between us. I had been an engineer of structures before the war, a man who understood the way things bore weight and where the stress points were, and when something was close to failing. I looked at Catherine's smile, and I felt the stress in it, and I told myself I was wrong. I was not wrong. She visited every day for the first 3 weeks. She brought books. She sat beside my bed and read aloud to me when my own concentration failed, which it did often in those early weeks. The pain and the adjustment and the simple enormity of what my life had become, making sustained thought nearly impossible. She talked to me about the town and about her father's work and about the things she was thinking, and she was warm and she was present and she was trying. I could feel her trying, and underneath the trying, I could feel the other thing. The thing she was not saying. The thing that lived behind her eyes when she looked at the space where the use of my legs used to be. My mother saw it too. I knew because of the way she watched Catherine from doorways, quiet and measuring, the way a woman watches something she is not yet ready to name out loud. Catherine's visits began to shorten, imperceptibly at first, then less imperceptibly. She began to mention obligations, her father's practice, a friend who needed her, a household matter that required attention. I did not push. I did not ask. I was 28 years old, and I had come home from a war without the use of my legs, and I had no appetite for forcing a conversation that I was not certain I could survive. 6 weeks after I came home, she came on a Sunday afternoon, and she sat beside me in the front room with the winter light coming pale and gray through the window, and she said she needed to speak plainly. I told her to go ahead. She said that she loved me. She said it first, and she said it clearly, and I believe she meant it completely. She said she had written every one of those letters with her whole heart, and that every word in them had been true. She said the 2 years of waiting had been among the hardest of her life, and that she had prayed for my return every single night without exception. And then she said that she did not know if she was capable of being what I now needed. The winter light sat between us. Outside the window, a crow crossed the gray sky. Inside the room, the fire crackled with a sound that seemed too ordinary for the moment. I asked her what she meant. She said it carefully and honestly, and without cruelty, because cruelty was not in her nature, that the life she had imagined for us, the farm and the children and the particular shape of the future she had been holding in her mind through all those letters, that life required things that she was no longer certain either of us could have. She said she did not know how to rebuild the picture. She said she was ashamed of herself for saying so. She said she was sorry. Samuel, I'm so deeply sorry. I looked at her for a long time, and then I said, I understand. 2 words, quiet and without trembling, because I would not tremble in front of her. I would not give my devastation that much room. She left an hour later. I heard the door close behind her, and I heard her footsteps on the porch, and then the sound of her horse moving away down the frozen road, and then nothing but the fire and the winter silence, and my mother appearing in the doorway of the front room with an expression that broke me more thoroughly than anything Catherine had said. Because my mother's face held no surprise. She had known. She had watched it coming for 6 weeks, and she had said nothing because she understood that some things cannot be softened by preparation. They simply have to land. She crossed the room, and she sat beside me, and she put her arm around my shoulders, and I put my face in my hands, and I wept. Not quietly, not with any dignity. I wept the way a man weeps when he has held himself together through 2 years of war and 4 days of unconsciousness and 6 weeks of careful adjustment, and has finally run out of the particular strength required to keep holding. My mother held me and did not say a single word, and that silence was the most merciful thing anyone has ever offered me. But I need you to stay, because what I discovered 3 months later about Catherine would hollow you out all over again. And what happened after that, the person who found me in the ruins of myself, that is the part that will put you back together. Keep listening. Winter settled over Millhaven like a judgment. The town continued its ordinary business around me, the commerce and the church and the social obligations of a small Ohio community, and I existed at the edge of it, present but not quite a participant, moving through the weeks in the particular fog that follows the loss of 2 enormous things at once. The physical recovery was relentless and unglamorous, the daily work of a body learning new terms of existence, the pain that came in waves, and the exhaustion that sat in my bones like wet clay. My brother Thomas had fashioned me a wheelchair of his own construction, rough but functional, that allowed me to move through the farmhouse and eventually onto the porch and then, in increments, into the wider world. The wider world was not always kind about it. People in Millhaven were not cruel in the overt way. They were kind in the particular manner of people who are uncomfortable with what they are looking at and are covering the discomfort with a performance of warmth. They said how good it was to see me. They said I was looking well. They said I was a hero of the Republic and that the town was proud. And then their eyes would drop, just briefly, to the chair, and something would move across their faces that was composed of pity and relief and the guilty gratitude of people glad it was not them. I became very familiar with that look. What I was not prepared for was what reached me on a Tuesday morning in February through the particular cruelty of small-town information. My friend and neighbor James, who was constitutionally incapable of withholding anything he knew, came to call and sat in the front room and told me, with visible discomfort but insufficient restraint, that Catherine had been seen in the company of a young man named Edward Marsh. Edward Marsh was the newly arrived son of a prosperous merchant family from Columbus who had settled in Millhaven the previous autumn. He was 26, sound of body, with good prospects and an easy manner, and absolutely no history of lying in a field hospital wondering if his legs would ever be more than dead weight beneath him. James said he thought I ought to know. I thanked him and saw him out and returned to the front room and sat by the window and looked at the snow on the fields and felt something move through me that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but something that sat exactly between the two, in the cold place where you understand that the world is what it is and people are what they are, and neither of those facts gives you any comfort at all. I did not see Catherine for 6 weeks after that. The town was small enough that avoidance required effort, and I made that effort with a thoroughness that told me, in the part of myself that was still capable of honest accounting, that I was not yet anywhere close to acceptance. And then one March morning, she came to the farm. She came alone, on foot, which meant she had walked 2 miles through the last of the winter mud, and she stood at the door of the front room in her coat with her cheeks red from the cold and asked if she could come in. I told her she could. She sat down. She did not remove her coat, which I noted. She folded her hands, and she looked at me with those gray eyes that had once been the most familiar thing in my world, and she told me the truth. All of it. She told me that she had met Edward Marsh at a gathering in November, and that she had not sought it and had not wanted it, but that he had been uncomplicated in a way that she found she needed desperately, a way that required nothing of her, that she was afraid she could not give. She said she knew what it looked like. She said she knew what it was. She said she was not asking for absolution, and she was not asking for anything at all except the chance to tell me herself before the town told me, in its own way with its own embellishments. I sat with that for a long time, and then I said, "Catherine, I have one question for you." She waited. "Do you love him?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment that contained multitudes. "I do not know yet," she said, "but I am not afraid of him. And I have been afraid of everything since you came home, and I do not know how to stop being afraid, and I am deeply ashamed of that. But it is the truth." The fire crackled. Outside the window, the first real signs of spring were showing in the mud, that particular brown-gray color that means the frozen ground is beginning to remember warmth. "I understand," I said again. 2 words again, because they were still the only ones that were entirely true. She left, and this time the sound of her footsteps on the porch felt different from the last time. It felt like a door not closing, but already closed, the sound of someone walking away from something that had already been resolved without either party being fully present for the resolution. I sat in the front room alone for a long time, and then my mother appeared in the doorway. She did not come in. She just looked at me with those quiet, knowing eyes, and then she said, "Samuel, there is someone I would like you to meet. I need you to stay." Because what my mother had been quietly doing while I was falling apart is the most extraordinary thing in this story. And what came from it will absolutely undo you. Please keep listening. Her name was my mother's doing entirely. My mother, who had watched me move through those winter months with the careful eyes of a woman who understood that grief left unaddressed becomes something harder and more permanent than grief, had taken matters into her own hands with a characteristic quiet efficiency. She had been corresponding, I later learned, with a woman she had known in her girlhood who had moved to Philadelphia and whose niece had recently relocated to the county to assist at the Quaker Mission School 3 miles outside Millhaven. The niece's name was Ruth. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late March with my mother, who had apparently offered to show her the farms in the area as a neighborly introduction to the county. And I found myself face to face across the kitchen table with a young woman of about 25 who had dark brown eyes and a direct manner that reminded me so startlingly of the directness I had always loved in Catherine that I felt a complicated and uncomfortable thing in my chest. Ruth was a teacher. She had studied at a time and in a way that required a particular kind of determination for a woman of that era, through correspondence and through the specific opportunities offered by progressive institutions. And she had come to the mission school because she believed, with a plain-spoken and uncomplicated conviction, that education was the most important work a person could do with their time on earth. She sat across from me, and she did not look at the chair, not in the way people usually did not look at it, which was a pointed and deliberate avoidance that called attention to itself. She simply did not look at it, because it did not appear to be the thing that interested her. What interested her was what I had said a moment before about the structural calculations my brother Thomas had used in making the chair and whether the weight distribution could be improved. I stared at her. She asked the question again, with the patient tone of someone accustomed to repeating themselves to people who were not quite paying attention. I answered it. We talked for 2 hours. My mother brought tea, and then supper, and then quietly disappeared from the kitchen entirely, which I recognized only in retrospect as a maneuver of considerable deliberateness. Ruth talked about the school and the children and the problems of teaching children who had no books and no slates and whose parents needed them in the fields and who came to learn anyway because something in them understood that knowledge was worth the walk. She talked about it with a passion that was entirely unperformed, the passion of someone who has found the work they were put on earth to do and has no reason to pretend otherwise. I talked about engineering, about the structures I had designed before the war, bridges and public buildings, the particular satisfaction of calculating exactly how much a thing could bear and building it to bear precisely that. I talked about it with a fluency I had not felt since before Petersburg, since before the fog of loss and recovery and grief had settled over the parts of my mind that were not simply trying to survive. She listened the way good teachers listen, actively, with follow-up questions that told me she was actually hearing what I said and not simply waiting for her turn. When she left that evening with my mother, she turned at the door and said, "I hope we will speak again, Mr. Samuel. I have more questions about load-bearing calculations, and I suspect you have more answers than you have had occasion to give lately." I watched her walk down the path to the road and felt something I had not felt in a long time. I felt interested. The recovery that followed that spring was different from the recovery that had preceded it. Not because Ruth was responsible for it. She would have been the first to reject that framing. No person is responsible for another person's healing. She said that plainly and early and meant it. But because something about those conversations, which became regular, which became a feature of my weeks in the way that her letters had once been a feature of my weeks at the front, gave me back the parts of my mind I had believed were buried under Petersburg. She brought me problems, real ones, practical ones, things at the school that needed solving, a roof that was failing, a well that needed repositioning, a small structure they wanted to build that their limited resources had to be applied to with maximum efficiency. She brought these problems not as charity, not as a way of making me feel useful, but because she actually needed them solved and had correctly identified that I was the person most capable of solving them. I solved them, first on paper and then, gradually and with Thomas's considerable physical assistance, in reality. The first time I went to the school, I did not know what to expect. I arrived in the wagon Thomas drove and was helped down and positioned in the chair, and I sat outside for a long moment looking at the door of the small building, at the sounds of children inside, at the ordinary, extraordinary business of a school morning. Ruth came to the door and looked at me. "Come in," she said. "We have been waiting for you." 12 children looked up from their slates when I came through the door. 12 small faces with the particular combination of curiosity and uncertainty that belongs to children encountering something unfamiliar. And then a small boy in the front row, no more than 7, looked at the chair and then looked at me and said with perfect straightforward childhood logic, "Does it go fast?" The room erupted in laughter. Ruth's loudest of all, something that had been clenched tight in my chest for months, came loose. Those months at the school became the architecture of my recovery in a way that nothing else had been. The children did not know about Petersburg or Catherine or any of it. They knew that the man in the chair could answer their questions and solve their problems and occasionally, when pressed, tell them about bridges. They treated me with the uncomplicated acceptance of people who have not yet learned to make the distinctions that adults make, and I found that acceptance more restorative than anything medicine or time had offered. And Ruth had her own history, a difficult family, years of working against expectations and around obstacles, a relationship in her early 20s that had ended in the specific way of relationships between people who want different things and take too long to admit it. She did not share all of this at once. She shared it the way you share things with someone you are beginning to trust, in pieces, in the margins of other conversations, and each piece fitted against the pieces I had shared in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like recognition. She was not Catherine. She was entirely herself, and who she was turned out to be exactly what the parts of me that were still intact needed to grow toward. Stay for the last part, because Catherine comes back, and what I do with that, what I choose when the choice is finally mine to make clearly and freely, that is the heart of this whole story. Do not go anywhere. The summer of 1865 arrived with the news of the war's end. Millhaven celebrated with bells and bonfires and the particular relief of a community that had sent its sons away and received some of them back, and was trying to find the language for what that meant. I sat on the porch of my parents' farmhouse on the evening of the celebration and listened to the distant sounds of the town rejoicing and felt something complicated and true, gratitude that it was over, grief for everything it had cost, a kind of tentative and fragile openness toward whatever came next. Thomas sat on the porch steps beside me. He had grown up while I was away and came into himself in the way of young men who were given responsibility and rise to it. He had kept the farm, cared for our parents, built me the chair with his own hands, and done all of it with a quiet dignity that I had not always given him sufficient credit for. We sat in the summer evening and listened to the celebrations and did not say very much, because some things between brothers do not require words. Ruth came by the following afternoon. She had been at the school that morning for the end of term, and she arrived at the farm with flour on her sleeve from the celebration baking she had helped with, and she sat down on the porch steps in the summer light and told me about the children and what they had said about the war ending and the particular wisdom of children's responses to large events, which always managed to be both more direct and more accurate than adult responses. I looked at her sitting in the summer light with flour on her sleeve and her dark eyes animated and her voice full of the work she loved, and I understood with a clarity that required no calculation at all what I was going to do. I told her I had something to say. She looked at me and waited with that patient teacher's attention. I told her that the months of knowing her had returned to me things I had believed were gone for good. Not replaced what had been lost. I was careful about that because I meant it honestly. Not replaced, but grown alongside, like new timber framing a damaged wall and making the whole structure sound again. I told her that she was the most genuinely good person I had encountered in my life. Not good in the performed or obligatory way, but good in the architectural sense, load-bearing, structural, the kind of good that holds things up. She smiled at that. I told her that I loved her. She was quiet for a moment. That was not the agonizing silence of uncertainty, but the considered silence of someone taking something seriously before responding to it. Then she said, I know. I have known for some time. I was waiting for you to know as well. I laughed. I laughed properly, with surprise and relief, and the specific joy of a man who has just been told by the person he loves that he was the last to understand something everyone else had already worked out. She reached across and took my hand. I want to tell you about Catherine before I close this chapter of the telling. She married Edward Marsh in September of 1865. I heard about it from James, who remained constitutionally unable to withhold information, and I sat with the news for a morning and found that it settled in me, without the devastation I might once have expected. Not without weight. It had weight. 6 years of letters in a train station and fireflies in the long grass do not become weightless simply because time passes. But the weight was bearable. It was the weight of something real that had existed and ended, not the weight of something broken. I wrote her a letter, short and genuine and without any performance of either indifference or lingering injury. I wished her well, and I meant it. I told her I hoped she had found the uncomplicated life she had been looking for. I did not tell her that I had found something better than uncomplicated. I did not tell her that what I had found was someone who looked at everything complicated about my existence and found it not burdensome, but interesting. Some things you keep for yourself. Ruth and I were married the following spring. The ceremony was at the mission school, surrounded by the 12 children who had grown to 15 by then, and Thomas stood beside me, and my mother sat in the front row with dry eyes and the expression of a woman whose quiet and persistent effort had yielded exactly what she had intended it to yield. Ruth wore a simple dress the color of winter wheat. She carried no flowers. She looked at me through the entire ceremony with those dark eyes that saw everything clearly and required no embellishment of the truth. We built a life together, a real one, the kind built from daily work and honest conversation, and the particular intimacy of two people who have both been shaped by difficulty and have chosen to build something with what the difficulty left behind. We expanded the school. I returned to engineering work, adapted but not diminished, contributing to structures that outlasted both of us. We had children of our own, 3 of them, who grew up in a house where books were everywhere and questions were welcomed, and the man in the wheelchair was the person who could answer almost anything if you asked him clearly enough. Thomas stayed on the farm and became exactly the kind of farmer and neighbor and man I had always suspected he would become. My mother lived to see her grandchildren and considered the entire arc of events, from my injury to my marriage to the expansion of the school, to have gone more or less precisely as she had intended. I never entirely stopped thinking about the train station in 1862, about her hands pressing mine and those gray eyes, and come back, Samuel, that is all I ask. I came back, just not the way either of us had imagined, but the life I came back to turn out to be more than the life I had left for. And that is a truth that took me years to be able to say without it costing me something. Now it cost me nothing. Now it simply is. Tell me in the comments what part of this story you felt most deeply. Was it the front room in winter and her words and the fire and those two inadequate words I gave back to her? Was it the schoolroom and the boy who asked if a chair went fast? Was it Ruth on the porch steps with flower on her sleeve in the summer light? Because some of you know exactly what it is to have the life you planned pulled away from you and to have to stand in the ruins of it and decide what to build next. And if you have dealt with something similar, share your story. You're not alone. You never were. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. Because that is the only story worth telling. The one where you decide, even after everything, that you are still here, still building, still choosing every ordinary, extraordinary day to be exactly where you are. I am Samuel. I came home from a war without my legs and lost the woman I planned to marry and found the life I was always meant to live. And I would not trade a single broken piece of it.